The judge had already begun reviewing the next matter on the docket when counsel requested permission to address an issue that had surfaced outside the ordinary sequence of filings. The interruption was measured, procedural in tone, but it was enough to redirect the courtroom's attention. A set of recently disclosed documents, identified as part of the broader Epstein archive now circulating through official channels, had been referenced in legal briefing, and counsel asked that their existence be acknowledged on the record. The request was not framed as an attempt to introduce evidence. Instead, it was described as a procedural clarification, an effort to ensure that the court understood the context in which certain arguments were being made. The distinction mattered. Disclosure of documents does not carry the same legal weight as admission into evidence, and both sides appeared careful to maintain that boundary from the outset. The judge asked a series of direct questions. What materials were being referenced? How they had been obtained through disclosure, and whether either party intended to rely on them substantively at this stage. Counsel responded that the documents had entered public circulation through authorized release mechanisms and were being cited only to explain the evolving landscape surrounding related proceedings. No request was made to authenticate the contents. No witness was called. The exchange remained firmly within procedural territory. Prosecutors rose briefly to emphasize that names appearing within investigative files are not findings of fact. Such references, they noted, often reflect leads, contacts, or contextual material gathered during large-scale inquiries. The government's position was that acknowledgment of the documents should not be mistaken for validation of every reference contained within them. Their remarks were concise, directed toward preserving the legal distinction between disclosure and proof. The courtroom, which moments earlier had been moving through routine scheduling matters, settled into a more deliberate stillness. Papers were arranged carefully. The clerk adjusted the record to reflect the discussion without characterizing the materials themselves. No one spoke beyond what was necessary to clarify procedure. The judge listened, reviewed the brief citations that had been provided, and made clear that the court would not treat the documents as evidentiary submissions. However, because they had been raised in argument, the court would acknowledge their existence for purposes of maintaining an accurate procedural record. That acknowledgment, the judge explained, was not an endorsement of the contents, but a recognition that the materials had entered the legal conversation surrounding the case. With that clarification, the court directed both sides to proceed cautiously in how such references were handled going forward, ensuring that procedural integrity remained intact while the matter continued to move through its established course. Following that clarification, the judge turned to the practical implications of what had just been placed on the record. The court emphasized that large-scale investigative disclosures often generate public attention, but the role of the courtroom is not to interpret publicity. Its responsibility is limited to determining what has procedural relevance and what does not. The distinction was repeated carefully so there would be no confusion between acknowledgment and adoption. Defense counsel confirmed that no motion was being made to admit the materials and that no reliance would be placed on unverified references contained within them. The purpose, counsel explained, was simply to prevent misunderstandings about citations that had already appeared in related filings. The judge accepted that explanation, but instructed that any future references must be narrowly tailored and clearly identified as background, not evidentiary fact. The prosecution agreed with that limitation, noting that investigative archives of this scale can contain thousands of names and references collected for review, many of which never become part of formal charges or findings. Because of that breadth, the government urged the court to avoid allowing such material to influence proceedings unless it met the established rules of admissibility. Their remarks reinforced that the courtroom operates under standards far stricter than those governing disclosure or publication. As the exchange concluded, the judge directed the clerk to annotate the transcript so that the record would reflect precisely what had occurred. Documents had been referenced, their existence acknowledged, and their evidentiary status expressly declined. This level of precision, the court explained, protects both parties from later claims that the materials had been treated as proof. The courtroom atmosphere remained controlled, with none of the urgency often associated with contested hearings. Instead, the process unfolded through careful statements and confirmations, each step reinforcing procedural boundaries. Observers seated in the gallery watched quietly, aware that the discussion centered not on allegations, but on how courts manage information once it enters the public domain. The judge then addressed both sides directly, reminding them that the court's function is to evaluate admissible evidence presented through proper channels, not to speculate about material disclosed elsewhere. Any attempt to blur that line, the judge cautioned, could risk delaying proceedings or inviting unnecessary disputes over relevance. With those instructions in place, the court indicated it was prepared to move forward with the scheduled agenda, having resolved how the newly disclosed documents would be treated within the framework of the case. The matter, while noted, would not alter the structure of the hearing unless formally raised through appropriate motion and supported by admissible proof. With the issue addressed, the judge directed counsel to return to the matters that had originally been scheduled for the session. The transition was deliberate, signaling that the court did not intend for the earlier discussion to expand beyond its limited procedural purpose. Files were repositioned, and the clerk confirmed the next item on the docket, restoring the structure that had briefly been interrupted. Defense counsel resumed argument on the pending motion, careful to avoid referencing the disclosed materials except where absolutely necessary to maintain continuity in the record. The language used was precise, framed around legal standards rather than external developments. This restraint reflected the court's instruction that proceedings must remain grounded in admissible submissions, not in documents circulating outside the evidentiary process. The prosecution followed in the same measured fashion, addressing statutory considerations and prior rulings relevant to the motion before the court. No attempt was made to revisit the earlier exchange. Instead, both sides treated it as a resolved matter, allowing the hearing to proceed without further complication. The courtroom's rhythm returned to its familiar cadence of argument, response, and clarification. At one point, the judge paused to reiterate a guiding principle. Courts are designed to test evidence through established rules, not to interpret the meaning of large disclosures released beyond the courtroom. That function, the judge explained, belongs to investigative bodies and public reporting, while the judiciary must confine itself to material properly presented and subject to challenge by both parties. The statement was entered into the record, underscoring the boundary between information that exists publicly and information that can influence judicial decisions. Observers in the gallery remained silent, listening as the proceedings unfolded with renewed focus on the legal questions actually before the bench. Counsel completed their arguments without further reference to the documents, and the judge acknowledged that both sides had complied with the court's earlier direction. The exchange demonstrated how quickly a potentially distracting issue can be contained when procedural limits are clearly defined. As the hearing continued, the courtroom environment reflected its primary function: evaluating motions, applying precedent, and maintaining a controlled forum for legal determination. The earlier mention of the Epstein-related disclosures, while noted in the transcript, no longer shaped the discussion. Instead, the session advanced according to its original agenda, illustrating how courts absorb external developments without allowing them to dictate the course of proceedings. By the time arguments concluded, the focus had fully returned to the legal framework governing the case, leaving the referenced documents acknowledged but procedurally separate from the evidence under consideration. After hearing from both sides, the judge closed the discussion on the pending motion and summarized the court's position for the record. The earlier reference to the disclosed Epstein-related documents, the judge noted, had been addressed solely to clarify procedural context and would not influence the court's evaluation of the issues properly before it. That clarification, already entered into the transcript, ensured that the record reflected a clear separation between acknowledgment of public disclosures and reliance on admissible evidence. The clerk confirmed that all statements had been accurately recorded. Counsel for both parties indicated there were no additional matters to raise regarding the documents or their treatment. With that confirmation, the judge reiterated that any future attempt to introduce such material would require formal motion, authentication, and the opportunity for objection under the rules of evidence. Without those steps, the court would not consider the contents substantively. The hearing then moved into its final administrative phase. Deadlines were reviewed, scheduling matters confirmed, and instructions issued for the submission of any supplemental briefs related to the motion argued earlier. These routine elements, delivered in the same measured tone, restored the session to its ordinary procedural footing. Observers in the gallery began to shift quietly as it became clear the matter was concluding. The courtroom, which had briefly paused to address an unexpected reference, now reflected the structured closure typical of federal proceedings. No further discussion of the documents occurred, and neither side attempted to revisit the issue. Before ending the session, the judge emphasized once more that courts must operate within defined evidentiary boundaries, regardless of the volume or publicity of external disclosures. The role of the judiciary, the judge explained, is to weigh material presented through proper legal channels, not to interpret information that has not been tested in court. With no additional business before the bench, the judge directed the clerk to mark the matter concluded for the day. The deputy announced adjournment, and the formal session came to an end. Counsel gathered their materials, preparing to continue the case through filings rather than argument. Court staff secured the record and powered down equipment, closing the official transcript of the hearing. The proceedings had absorbed an unexpected reference, clarified its place within the legal framework, and moved forward without allowing it to alter the structure of the case. An example of how courts acknowledge external developments while maintaining strict procedural control over what ultimately enters the judicial record.